Welcome back to the DVD series on the resurrection, the Case for the Resurrection DVD series. I'm here with Mike Licona. I'm Michael Patton. Great to have you guys. I'm so glad you all are studying this in such a way. I'm so glad that you're taking this topic seriously, looking at the historicity of the resurrection. Can we look at an event of the past and in any sense gain confidence in that event that actually happened? And this particular event is the resurrection of Jesus. We read in the Bible. Got a Bible here. Love the Bible. I believe the Bible's inspired. I believe the Bible's inerrant, which means I believe that it's not only inspired, but it, in the originals, had no errors at all, right? Whenever it was written. So I'm committed to the Scripture. However, whenever we're talking to people out there that are listening to this, they may say, you know what, do you have to have the Bible? Do you have to have inspiration? Do you have to have inerrancy in order for this to be true? They may say, you know what, I don't believe the Bible, so your whole talk about the resurrection and proofs of the resurrection is meaningless to me. Inspiration and inerrancy, are those required as a historian for you to verify?
Not at all. I mean, we wouldn't require that of any other book or source out there in order to learn something. Listen, I'm a Christian. I recognize the Muslims have the Quran as their scriptures. Now, I don't believe that the Quran is divinely inspired or inerrant in any sense. In fact, I think it's completely man-made. That God didn't have any part whatsoever in the production of the Quran. Nevertheless, as a historian, I can still learn from the Quran. So for example, in one of the surahs or chapters where it talks about God talking to Jesus and asking Jesus, did you say that you, Mary, and me are all gods? And Jesus says, well, of course I didn't. You know all things. You would know if I had said that. I never said that. I only said, I'm your servant, worship God. So I don't believe that conversation ever took place or ever will take place. But as a historian, as a student of history, it tells me that in the 7th century, when the Quran was being composed, that there were Christian and Muslim dialogues going on where Christians were saying Jesus is divine and Muslims were saying, no, he isn't. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. Or likewise, when the Quran says to lie in bush for the infidels and ambush and kill them, that I don't believe God ever told Muhammad that. Nevertheless, it does tell me as a student of history that in the 7th century, Muslims were killing non-believers. So in the same way, many skeptical scholars, you don't have to be a Christian to come to the biblical literature and learn historical matters from it. So they can come and find out all kinds of stuff about Jesus and the early church from reading the New Testament literature. They don't believe it's divinely inspired. They won't believe everything that it says, of course, in it. But we can still apply historiographical principles to the New Testament literature to learn about Jesus in the early church.
And remember, this is one of the unique things that we're trying to give in this DVD series. It's going to be different, I think, and that's one of the great things about having you here and having you teach this, is that it is different. We are trying to teach you to be historians. We are trying to teach you to look at this as objectively as possible. As we said last time, none of us are perfectly objective, but as historians, because we believe so much that the historical case for the resurrection is so strong. And so bear with us as we continue to try to shape you into a historian first, so that you can look at these things through the historical eye. And so from a historian standpoint, here's the key starting point. I believe the Bible's inspired, you believe the Bible's inspired. I believe the Bible's inerrant, you believe the Bible's inerrant, but we don't have to have that in order to establish the historicity of the resurrection, the most important central event of the Christian faith, that if it happened, Christianity is true. If it did not happen, Christianity is false. And so that's one of the main things that we look at. Now, we say sources. One of the key things, and sorry for putting you on the spot here, because I want to ask you this question. If I'm seeing things right, and feel free on video to say you're wrong. Okay.
Okay.
Whenever I look at all the different religions, one of the main questions I get from people all the time is, yeah, what about all the other religions in the world, you know? Some people will even be very sincere Christians, I think, and say, I'm very confused because, yes, I believe that Jesus rose from the grave, but I don't know about other religions and whether or not they are true. And how can we say we're right and others are wrong? But whenever we look at this uniquely from a historian standpoint, is this right? The resurrection presents a unique event in history, an establishing event, that establishes the footprint of God in history. And whenever you look at all the other religions, it's normally a very subjective thing that you can't test.
Right.
It's an encounter with an angel. It's a private encounter with God. It's a dream that you had. It's a lot of wisdom that you're built in with.
Read
Nothing
this
I
book
can test.
and pray, and God will show you it's true.
Yeah, that's right. The establishing marker of Islam, I can't ever test that. I can't ever test whether or not Muhammad had that experience because it doesn't have any of these types of historical markers. And I would say Christianity is unique because if God communicated and if he's come in history and made that footprint, it ought to have a tidal wave that you and I can test 2,000 years later.
Right, and we do. You know, Jesus said that if you want to know if Jesus rose from the, or if you want to know if Christianity is true and the things he was claiming, then his resurrection would be the verification event. But that does us no good unless we can actually verify it today, and I think we can.
700 pages that you have studied yourself. And tons of people have written on this. Your friend Gary Habermas has written extensively on this, but everybody approaching it from a historical method. So we're coming in and we're beginning to talk about sources. And so this footprint has been made, and how do we establish this footprint has been made? What are our sources that we have available? You've mentioned them before in the previous session, but let's start digging a little bit more to that.
Well, one of the first things the historian must do is determine his or her pool of sources that they're going to draw from in order to see, you know, what happened in the past. What are the reports? So the first thing we're going to look at, of course, is the biblical literature, because that's going to be the earliest. That's going to be the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Paul's letters, you know, all kinds of things like that are going to be our primary sources. So you've got 4 biographies in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John written within, say, 20 to 65 years of the events they purport to describe. You've got Paul's letters, which are even earlier, you know, written with, a couple of decades of Jesus' death. And with Paul's letters, fortunately, there are some clues in there that tell us that he's getting a lot of his information from the Jerusalem apostles, and that what he is about to teach when it comes to the core doctrines, the gospel essentials, the gospel message he's preaching, we can be certain, historically certain, that he is preaching what the Jerusalem apostles were preaching. So those are going to be very, very strong sources, especially what we find in Paul's letters. You have what are called the Apostolic Fathers, and not all of them, because not all of them are going to deal with the resurrection of Jesus, but people such as Clement of Rome and Polycarp. Clement was probably acquainted with, discipled by, mentored by the Apostle Peter. Polycarp probably by the Apostle John. And so what they have to say about the resurrection of Jesus is going to be very profound and valuable for us. There's also non-Christian sources of the period, like Tacitus, Josephus, Lucian, Marabar, Serapion, things like that. Now, they're going to yield little results for us, but some of them are going to be pretty good. You know, like Josephus talks about Jesus' death by crucifixion, and that he did wondrous deeds and things like this. Tacitus, same kind of thing. So that's going to be valuable. And then we're going to also consider Gnostic sources and other Christian sources in non-canonical literature written within, let's say, 200 years of Jesus' death. When we do this, we're going to find that Paul's letters especially, and the oral tradition embedded in them and peppered throughout Paul's letters, is going to be our very best sources, our most secure sources. And then we'll follow that with, say, the Gospels, some of the Apostolic Fathers, the Acts sermon summaries, things like that.
Okay, we've been talking about sources and trying to understand what are the sources available with regard to the resurrection of Jesus from a historian standpoint. And I think it'd be good to gain some perspective here because there's a lot of events. I mean, people go to school, and everybody that's listening to this has learned about other events of the past, whether it be ancient events in the ancient Near East, or events where we memorize the different presidents that have been president of the United States. Give us some, if you can, give us some perspective here. Whenever we're studying ancient sources, Caesar, the ancient wars, and the Greek and the Roman empires, is it comparable? Do we believe these events based upon an abundance of sources, or how much sources from a historian standpoint is enough in comparison to the New Testament?
Well, gosh, that's a little subjective, kind of. It might vary in every situation, but just for example, Caesar Augustus, the Roman emperor who ruled at the time of Jesus' birth, he is regarded as the greatest of the Roman emperors. And historians consult 6 chief sources for the life of Caesar Augustus. One is a funerary inscription written at the time of his death. It's less than 4,000 words. The other 5 were all written 90 to 100 years after Caesar's death. But we have an abundance of sources there. There's 6 of them. Now, the funerary inscription is probably going to be the best. It's going to be somewhat biased, right?
Yeah.
But it's going to probably be our best source, and then you're followed by
Because it's the closest?
Yeah, probably because it's the closest. It's going to list some things, but it is still going to be biased, of course, because it's going to say things as a eulogy, kind of,
Yeah.
And then you have Plutarch, who's writing about 90 years later, and actually he only mentions Caesar Augustus, but we don't have his biography on him. It's been lost, unfortunately. But he's going to mention him sometimes throughout, like in his biography of Julius Caesar, his biography of Antony. It's still going to talk about Octavius, or who later becomes Caesar Augustus. So we're going to learn from Plutarch on these things. So these are going to be good things, but we only have 6 chief sources for Caesar Augustus. And we're going to learn some good things. We're going to compare these sources.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, with Jesus, we have 4 biographies written within 20 to 65 years of his life. And then we have some Jesus tradition that's peppered in Paul's letters, which is even earlier. So we got some pretty good stuff when it comes to Jesus.
And whenever you're talking about this, you see you're mentioning the Bible, and I just say this again because I've encountered this so much, and I understand where people are coming from. But again, whenever we talk about this as a historian, it's maybe even best not to call it the Bible, right? Let's just call it 27 documents of the New Testament that are source documents, right? Because that's what you do as a historian in studying an event, whether it actually took place. You don't take it as a unit. You say, here are separate documents. You said there are 4 different biographies.
Right.
You didn't say there's a Bible that teaches it.
Right.
And you gotta think of that first, folks, because whenever you're doing history, you want multiple, you said last time, multiple attestation, multiple accounts,
right,
multiple resources, and think of it, take the little binder off just for now, okay? You can put it back on in a little bit. Take the little binder off that connects all these, and we've got a lot of different ancient documents.
Well, even the discussion how the Bible how it was compiled into a single volume, why some books and letters were chosen, say for the New Testament, while the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Thomas and some others were excluded. That shows this isn't just, it is a single volume for us. It's a collection of Christian literature from the first century that, over the years, Christians have regarded as authoritative for their lives. But it's a single volume for us, but it wasn't for the ancients.
Yeah.
It was 27 individual books and letters. So, you can look at multiple independent sources in terms of things like, well, we know that Matthew and Luke used Mark. So in many cases, that's going to be one source. But in other cases, Matthew and Luke are going to contain independent information. Yeah. So, but John is typically regarded as independent of the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
And John is 92% different than the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right?
I'm not sure of the percentage, but there's significant difference.
I know the percentage. It's 92.
Okay, I trust you. Well, I don't know. You're a shady source, though.
That's true.
Even though you're an eyewitness,
but I can get multiple attestation on that.
Yeah, and you can get it from Paul, because Paul has some information on Jesus' sayings at the Last Supper in 1 Corinthians 11. That's almost word for word for what we have in Luke's account of it, but it differs slightly in the wording, although the gist of the message is the same, in Matthew and Mark, who is using the same source. So you have multiple independent sources there. That was pretty cool stuff.
As a historian, I may come up to you and say, are you happy with the amount that we have? Do we need more? Is it something that we have to teeter on the edge of maybe, maybe not? Is it sufficient?
Well, I think what we have is sufficient for certain things. It's sufficient for us to adjudicate on the matter of Jesus' death and resurrection, I believe. It may be insufficient to determine the virgin birth or whether Jesus walked on water or whether he fed the 5,000. But if I had my choice, I'm glad we've got the evidence that can confirm the resurrection. If I had to choose between that and the virgin birth, I'll take the resurrection every day.
Yeah.
Because this is the confirmation of Christianity, the other isn't.
Yeah. And listen to this. Listen to the way he's talking, because it's so important. Again, this is the uniqueness of what we're trying to do here during this series. It's not as if Mike or I say, well, we're not sure about the virgin birth, or we're not sure that Jesus walked on water. It's from a historian standpoint what can be established most firmly. And what he just talked about was the existence, the life, the death, crucifixion, and the resurrection of Jesus. And if we establish those, all dominoes fall from there. So hang with us. I know it's different. Just hang with us as we walk through this, because we're trying to teach how to be historians in this.
Yeah, just because it's the Bible, again, that's just looking at it as one book. But listen, if even atheist, agnostic, and Jewish historians who don't believe the resurrection, who don't believe Jesus is divine, if they can come to the New Testament literature and believe that they can learn historical facts or details about Jesus, then they understand how this all works. And yes, the biblical authors were biased, but we're all biased. And if we're going to say that you can't believe the New Testament literature because the authors are biased, well then I'd say don't pick up Richard Dawkins' book if you're an atheist, because he's biased.
Yeah.
Don't pick up any book written by a Jewish historian writing on the Holocaust, because they're biased.
Yeah.
Don't pick up any book written by an African American historian writing on the slavery in the United States, because they're biased. Bias doesn't mean you're wrong. In fact, it can cause you to dig into it a little bit more to find facts that someone who really doesn't care too much about it would be looking for. And we got to remember that when we're reading, we have our own biases. So this could be accurate, and then you have a non-believer come to it, reading it with uber skepticism, and that would be their problem.
Yeah. If we have the sources available towards us, and that's the subject of this particular lesson, is sources. We at least have them now to examine, which we're going to be going through and talking about over the weeks to come. Speaking about the sources and saying we have at least as much, if not much more, evidence than most of the events that we believe in the past. If somebody were to say, well, I still don't believe it because I need more. I need even more. Instead of 4 Gospels, I needed 8.
Right.
Instead of 8, I needed 16.
Yeah. So is it sufficient? I guess that's all in the eyes of what one's requiring.
But if one's requiring that much, wouldn't you say that you might as well just not believe anything in the past at all?
Yeah. Be consistent at least. Be consistent in what you're requiring, because like you just said, you want to make sure what you are requiring is not unreasonable. If you have this, I like to look at it and say to a skeptic, if they're just being unreasonable, I say, well, apply that criteria to any other ancient event. And let's see, are you going to have to reject almost all of the past? Because you probably would, based on that kind of a burden of proof.
Yeah. Well, we would expect if something like this happened, if a resurrection happened, and if people really change their lives, if God is acting in history, and if He comes make a footprint, we got the sovereign God. We would expect, if that happened, for there to be a tidal wave. That there would be these sources. There would be not some obscure guy that we heard about saw Jesus rose from the grave, but that God would really impact widely. And I think that as we move through this series, that's what we're going to find, is that there's an abundance of evidence for us to leave as historians saying it's really true. The resurrection really happened.